Local experts gather to discuss the promise and pitfalls of artificial intelligence. Then, rules for visiting, just in time for the holidays, a literary look at staying on your best behavior, plus a deeper look at an ugly Jaguars performance. But first, it passed the bar exam, it won an art competition, and it's helped diagnose rare diseases. Artificial intelligence is developing at breakneck speed and brings the promise of great rewards and risks. That's the subject of a panel discussion tonight at the University of North Florida. We're talking to two participants plus a local high school teacher who's coping with the impacts of AI in the classroom. Here to discuss the issue, Dr. Josh Gellars, Associate Professor at UNF's Department of Political Science and an expert with the Global AI Ethics Institute. Welcome, Dr. Gellars.
Good morning, Ann.
Dr. Georgette Dumont, Associate Professor of Political Science and Public Administration and a moderator of tonight's panel. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. David Harvey, current high school English teacher with, did you say 23 years?
27.
27 years. I don't want to deprive you of those extra years teaching in Duval and St. Johns County schools. So welcome all of you. We also want to hear from you. Are you concerned about how AI will impact your work or your personal life? Give us a call at 549-2937. Tag us on X at FCC On Air or send an email to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also message us on the First Coast Connect Facebook and Instagram pages. So, Dr. Gellars, artificial intelligence can mean a lot of things. It's our Roombas, it's Siri, but you and the discussion tonight is focused on generative AI. Can you explain what that is and how it's different from those more common applications that we're used to?
Sure. So the first thing is that generative AI relates to one of the different branches within artificial intelligence, which is known as machine learning. And so what generative AI involves are algorithms that translate inputs into outputs, which can be visual, audio, even physical, depending on how things are working. And so the other examples that you provided were other domains of artificial intelligence, like robotics. You know, I have a Roomba in my household, so I'm no stranger to that. And what makes this a lot different is that you put something into the system, and then it creates something else that is potentially useful for you or other people by virtue of the algorithms that are used based on data that they've been trained on.
And so there was something early on developed called neural networks, which is basically you can teach a machine, a computer, to recognize a cat by showing them a lot of cat pictures. Mm-hmm. But it developed beyond that in terms of it being able to generate, that's the name generative AI, content. How did that change?
So, well, to begin, neural networks are models based off of the human brain. And so it's a way of training data in a way that will kind of model what happens within our own thought processes, or what they think our thought processes operate under. So the traditional kind of, traditional AI just sort of takes data and then finds patterns and is able to predict things. What's different about generative AI is the output, the kind of output that is generated, and the degree to which we have to actively train it. In the case of a lot of the generative AI that you're talking about, this is unsupervised machine learning, where you, as you mentioned, throw it a bunch of data and then it begins to recognize patterns on its own, which it sort of assigns rules and things like that, and then it will spit out some kind of output. But that's not always the case in terms of the quality of the output. One of the examples I read recently was you give it a whole bunch of recipes and AI turned out a recipe for baked chocolate chicken, which doesn't sound too appetizing.
I'd give it a shot. Sort of like chicken mole, right? A little bit. Anyway, Dr. Dumont, what is it about this issue that you and UNF feels needs attention? What's the goal of today's panel discussion?
Right. So thank you. The main goal is we're going to be grouping it into ethics, education, and employment, and how AI is going to be impacting that in the future for specifically college students. But the panel itself is part of the Office of Public Policy at UNF. The state has asked all of its state institutions to promote civil discourse and have different viewpoints available on campus, and this is one of the attempts. Last month or the month before, it was the First Amendment and free speech. So we as higher education, and we as the UNS specifically, are really interested in engaging our students to understand AI, what it is, what it can do, and then the ethics behind that in their development. For their
And this is just the second of these discussions. You say the first one was focused on the First Amendment, the second on AI. I guess that kind of gives us some indication where it falls in at least the university's perception of how significant a development it is.
And I'd go beyond the university. This isn't a new implementation. This is almost a revolution. It's a different way of creating information. It's if you really dig into it. So on my drive in this morning, I was actually listening to a podcast that was all AI. The podcast person and the people that the podcaster was interviewing was all AI, and they were developing answers and questions. It was very interesting that as to where it can go. So like some of this is the like the fun stuff. That fun.
Yeah.
But then if you look in the medical fields, you're going with AI, AI and generative AI, they're going to be able to just scan and analyze so much data that the human mind wouldn't be able to do, to be able to find solutions for cancer, for things like that. And so it's absolutely mind-boggling as to where it can go in the future. In the meantime, we have to deal with some of the small stuff. How do we shape the work environment knowing that AI is going to have a big impact? So the actors strike and the writers strike, AI was a large piece of that because they could become obsolete, but not really. So they had to figure out ethically, how can studios and producers use AI that it's profitable for them, but also protects the individuals who are in that space.
And so looking ahead, there's a lot of opportunities with AI, but David Harvey, you're already seeing the impacts of AI with your students. Tell me what you're seeing and how it's changing the classroom.
Well, pretty straightforward. It's a academic integrity issue where if a student is 16 years old and they've got 3 assessments coming up, and they can just ask ChatGPT, discuss the symbolism in Great Gatsby or Kafka's Metamorphosis, and it cranks out an essay for them. Pretty straightforward, pretty easily. So it's relatively well written. So our issues are mostly with plagiarism and teaching the kids how to use it appropriately.
And so what do you do? I mean, is it recognizable to you as a teacher with all of your experience when a student is using some sort of ChatGPT type program?
Well, that's where I start. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, we get to know the kids' writing, so they do a lot of in-class journaling and writing. And so as soon as they run that through, it's amazingly grammatically correct, and a lot of the kids struggle with that. I'm not trying to be mean to them, but it's pretty obvious. So the way I approach it is simply is, how do we use it as a good research tool? We ask it questions about texts, and then we look at its response, and we does that make sense? Is it something that you thought is interpretation that's valid? So for non-native speakers, it's really good help for sentence framing and teaching vocabulary. So it's great for modeling, things like that. So it's got a lot of great uses, and I'm just trying to get the kids discussing it, looking at it. We work at it with it in class, and then say, okay, listen, when you punch in the question, it comes back to this response. That's its idea. It's not yours. And so how are we going to cite this if we're doing an MLA paper or whatever? So it's just part of that conversation. Yeah.
Okay. Got a call from Mark on line 1. Good morning, Mark, on the south side. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. Interesting topic. When I first learned about ChatGPT, I downloaded it onto my iPad, and I went on there and kind of played it. It is interesting. Type in a question, it'll give you a little bit of an essay or an answer. But then I thought, all right, how does it do with something that is somewhat controversial? And I'm not going to mention what I typed in, but what I typed in was, I guess in today's climate, kind of a controversial question. I asked it to write me a paper. ChatGPT came back and said, sorry, we will not do that because we, and I'm paraphrasing here, we respect all lives, this, that, and the other thing. That was okay with me, but what that told me was that there is automatic bias built into GPT. Somebody had to put in there, no, you're not going to respond this way when you have a question such as what you put in. And so even though it's kind of interesting, you say, well, ChatGPT or AI might be able to diagnose a patient or something. Ultimately, somebody's bias is in there. And I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing.
Thank you, Mark. Great comment. For our listeners, are you concerned about bias in AI or how it might impact your role or your work? Please join our conversation. Call us at 549-2937. or send an email to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. Dr. Gellars, ChatGPT, which a lot of people are familiar with, is able to recognize patterns and predict what comes next. How is that any different from human reasoning? How is that different from human intelligence?
Boy, this is a question that would rankle a lot of AI ethicists. The reality is that it's sometimes in the eye of the beholder, as was just mentioned a moment ago, in terms of trying to suss out what is human-generated content, what is artificially generated content. And so there are a lot of folks who take great exception to the idea that what we're doing, or what ChatGPT or any other kind of form of generative AI is doing, is sort of synonymous with human creative activity. Rather, it's just this sort of, very sophisticated statistical tool that doesn't know what's going on under the hood and just spits out predictive text based on associations that it has generated on its own. So, but to the untrained eye, to someone who hasn't used it before, or someone who's maybe not familiar with the technology, it can seem like magic. It can seem like it is a conscious being that is articulating thoughts in a very interesting way. And what my own take on this is that ultimately it depends on who is interacting with the generative AI and what their perception is. It's not so much what's actually happening under the hood that matters.
But to be fair, I mean, scientists themselves, researchers, were surprised when this technology proved able to kind of go beyond what it was being fed and kind of create its own content in a way. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think the broader concern is what's called artificial general intelligence, where AI will be able to be applied in virtually any kind of setting that a human would normally be involved in and exceed human capacity. And so there's a lot of fear, and some people argue that it is overwrought and then not really reflective of reality, that it's going to overtake society once we've reached this point of what's called the singularity, and humans are going to become obsolete ourselves. So that is actually quite a big debate that's going on in the AI ethics community right now.
And what do you have a take on that?
Yeah, I think that we are not at the point where there is anything close to artificial general intelligence, and I don't think it's going to happen in the near future. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned about the kinds of issues that the caller raised, where ironically what was happening in that instance was an ethical guardrail was being implemented to prevent the data from saying something maybe really crass. So even though he was looking for an insight that maybe would give him a clear perception about where ChatGPT fell on a particular ethical issue, the way that it has been addressed within the model is to prevent that from happening, so that you don't think that there's a bias in the machine.
So can you just quickly define what a singularity is, you mentioned?
That's the point where the intelligence or the ability of artificial intelligence exceeds human capacity, and it basically overtakes society. And you've seen things like this in, Westworld, for instance, like the machines sort of take over. That's this sort of sci-fi, apocalyptic view of what might happen. But there are people who are even some notable scholars who think that not only is sort of artificial general intelligence on the horizon, some people think it's already here. I don't think that there's a lot of merit to that, but there are people making those arguments right now.
So there's the sci-fi reality, Dr. Dumont, and then there's this practical reality that you're talking to students who are heading out into the workforce very soon. A lot of concerns about how AI could impact the workplace. The World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report in 2023 found 40% of all working hours could be impacted by AI, and that 1 in 5 American workers have a job with what they call high exposure to artificial intelligence. What are you trying to bring out tonight at this discussion that you think it's important for future leaders and for graduating students to know?
Right. So for the first piece is for them to be adaptable. When we look at technology jumps in our past, just the internet, the broad use of the internet, phones before that, electricity, all of these were groundbreaking, but they never replaced humans and what they needed to do. It adjusted what they had to do at the workplace. It made work life a little bit easier, usually for some. But what our goal is, what my goal is to get the students to think in adaptive ways as to how they can utilize this technology in the workplace and think of that next best thing. So this is what AI can do. And right now we're pretty much putting it into a box, into that frame as to this is what it can do and how it will help. But then there's that other piece, that next step that will really blow it out of the water. So we wouldn't have the internet without the communication networks and without electricity. Nobody was thinking about the internet when they were first playing around with electricity. And nobody's really thinking about what that next best thing is. So when we start looking at new technologies and how we adapt to them, it usually is to make work life a little bit easier. The flip side of that is when work life gets a little bit easier and it doesn't take you as long to do things, there's always something that's going to be filling in that space. So it's not like our work time is going to be reduced by 40%. So we'll still be putting in the same amount, but 40% is going to be used for something else. We don't know what that is. It could be reduced. Employers can reduce their workforce, or they could add additional people to a different section of their jobs to be able to start leveraging AI for their particular uses.
So we've got a caller, Kathy, on line one, says she did an experiment with AI. Good morning, Kathy. Welcome to First Coast Connect.
Yeah, hi. So I just put in the question, I asked AI to write a review of the movie Women Talking that Sarah Polley directed. And I asked it to do it in the style of Pauline Kael, who'd written reviews back in the 70s and 80s. At any rate, it came back and gave a different name for the director. Like I didn't tell the AI, who the director of the film was, but it gave a different name, and it was a man's name. And so I, asked the question again, same kind of, thing. It was a, detailed response, but gave this man's name as the director of the film, which was inaccurate. So my biggest concern is really about inaccuracies, about misinformation, and about, AI kind of, manipulating data. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy, for calling. I think in recent months, we may have all heard the story about the attorney that tried to do a legal filing, and the paper that he put before the court was citing all kinds of legal precedents that didn't exist and cases that had never occurred. So that's, I think, a concern, the accuracy. Is that something that you talk to your students about, David Harvey?
Indeed. That's my framework. My approach is to just get them working with it and seeing what it does. And can it be helpful if you're analyzing a text? Can it be helpful for background research about a novel, for example? And we get a full range of things. And the best moments we've had in the class are when we ask it a question and then it spurns a discussion about a particular interpretation of a text. And so the kids, they're seeing it because they're not getting anything else anywhere else. The kids I'm teaching, I'm asking them, is it a conversation that's going on in class? There's no policy that I've seen, I've read in our district that says anything about it. I'm just looking at it as an academic integrity issue, my first major concern. But again, to see it as the good and the bad side of it, like what can it do to kind of inspire or spur a conversation, and how are they going to work with it? Because like you said, they're going to get to college and it's going to be in the workforce. They're going to get out there. It's a reality. They already see it. They know what it is. They all have it. So
it does seem like something that ought to be taught, not just as an incidental, but really as kind of, almost a class load, that people are learning the pitfalls, the fact that it may not always be accurate, those kinds of things, so that they're not unduly reliant on that information.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things is, as a faculty member at either K through 12 or college, you need to then start looking at how you're going to readjust your assignments so that they know how to leverage ChatGPT, but it's not just ChatGPT. So it's teaching them how to do prompts and understand that it's a conversation. And then there is that question, at what point is it plagiarism, or when does it become the individual's own work product because of the questions and the framing that the individual engaged with ChatGPT in? So these are some of those larger questions. But I guess luckily for us, we don't have students who are really being that savvy with it, to the best of my knowledge, because we're dealing with it at the college level as well. But it's reframing, understanding what ChatGPT can do and what its strengths are, and then where it doesn't really fill in, and we need to get the students in that mode where they're using their own minds and not just prompting ChatGPT to produce their work.
We have an interesting call related to that. John from Riverside, I believe, has been using AI to teach himself. Good morning, John. Welcome to First Coast Connect.
Good morning. Yeah, I've been using AI to learn Spanish. I've done a lot of work on it. Now I'm at the point where I will go on and I'll write something out as best I can, then I'll ask it for corrections and examples of how I could have said it more naturally. I went to see the movie Barbie, and so I'm always looking for what can I talk about with AI to expand my range in Spanish. So I wrote a long paragraph on Barbie, the history of Barbie, and then I was going to write my thoughts about the movie. And when I hit send, everything evaporated. And there was a message came up. I had broken moral rules or some kind of moral rule. So I went in and I asked it a question about what moral rule I had broken, and that evaporated too. And so here is the thing where we may be putting it in charge by the things that it'll accept, it won't. Now, I understand if I said, where can I find, I don't know, drugs or prostitution or something, I can see why it might kick me out for a keyword, keywords like that. But there was making some sort of moral judgment about my description of a little girl's doll, and the closest I can think I came to it was I talked about how she had an unrealistic body. Now, maybe that I still don't. My problem is I don't know why it kicked me out. I don't know what moral judgment it made about my use of it and my restriction of use of it.
Interesting. Well, we'll talk to Dr. Gellars about that. Good luck with your Spanish. Adios, John. Dr. Gellars, what do you think about that? What do you think was triggering that program?
Well, gracias, John. It's one of those things where it's a black box, and that's part of the problem that a lot of people have identified. We don't know what's going on under the hood, and sometimes there are going to be these sorts of judgment calls that are made ostensibly for ethical reasons, but if you don't disclose them, then someone like John may not understand the reason for rejecting his particular prompt. So some of it, to draw a corollary to what Dr. Dumont was saying, is a factor related to how we learn to be what are called prompt engineers. So maybe part of the issue is that we need to learn how to better craft the kinds of prompts that we are using to get the sort of outcomes that we're interested in getting. And that's actually quite both sort of an art and a science. And I think that that's something that we're going to be working on at UNF and teaching our students. I know in one of my classes, I have an assignment that students use ChatGPT to critique the output. And my argument is that helps them to refine their own knowledge of the theories that we're talking about in class. But in the case of what John illustrated, it is very frustrating if you don't feel like you have a handle on why something that you wrote might have been, cast aside. And so that may have been a kind of inappropriately labeled comment, but you don't have any opportunity to intervene and to respond in a way. And that can be, for the user, I think, a very frustrating outcome.
Interesting. We also have a call from Barry on the west side. Good morning, Barry. What's your experience with ChatGPT?
Good morning. By the way, on the professor's comment about the prompt and how you need to work on it, after years of working on Westlaw, a research program, one becomes very adept at the prompt and how much difference it makes and how quickly you can get your answer. But I called because I made a question to chatbot AI. I think it was about football, and it gave me an answer, and then all by itself, a few seconds later, it came back and said, "I'm mistaken," and corrected the answer. And I thought that was interesting. Thank you.
That's an interesting ability. I guess it can second guess itself, Dr. Dumont?
Well, it sounds that way, which I guess is a good thing, as long as it's as long as it's giving you the right information. So when we're looking at the quality of information that's coming out of ChatGPT, some of the basic stuff is fine, but then ChatGPT can also do what's called hallucinating. It just makes stuff up, which is what you were referring to with the brief from. So it can do that. So generative AI is pulling so much information that's out there, but we also, and so what we've been talking about with bias has been the bias of the system that we're working with, not the bias that's already inherently embedded in the information that it's pulling from. So we're looking at two levels of biases. So there's the bias of the information that's just out there. So these are these large language models that, it just takes everything, and regardless of where it gets, it does not rank this information a little higher than this information. It has all of this information. But what we're referring to is ChatGPT and the black box. We're not quite sure what it's deciding is good and bad. But then, if you just even had the information out that was raw, there's no mediating piece. And I guess that's what the ChatGPT and stuff, they're trying to be a little bit mediating. But again, we don't know.
Based on their own impressions of what they think is appropriate.
Right. And so this is where we start looking at how we have regulation over ChatGPT or any kind of generative AI at the state and the national and the international level, because we need to have some kind of a framework on make sure that we're all on the same playing field per se as to how these tools are going to be used going forward.
And so there has been some movement on that front just recently in terms of how it's being used by the military. Earlier this month, 28 governments, including the U.S. and China, agreed to the idea that artificial intelligence poses a potentially catastrophic risk to humanity, which is no small thing. It was the first international agreement on AI, but there is still little understanding on what regulators might do or who should create regulations. So anticipating a lot of problems, Dr. Geller, but not a lot of certainty about how to handle that.
And right now, what's happened is you've got mostly the Wild West and then the EU. And the EU has been setting the agenda, and the U.S. is playing catch up. And so the Biden administration has started to take this on. There have been a lot of announcements as of late. There was an executive order in the past couple of weeks on AI. So we're just trying to do everything that we can to address the nature of the challenges. I think on the downside, that the people who have been largely involved in those conversations are the very people who stand to benefit by the use of artificial intelligence, like big tech executives. So if you watch any of these congressional hearings about how should we regulate AI, the people who are often invited to those conversations are the people who are using it at large enterprise scale for profit purposes. And so what we actually need is a much more diverse, rich conversation, much more pluralistic with the kinds of stakeholders that are involved, because we know that the creation of bias, as Dr. Dumont was talking about, is in part a reflection of the lack of participation from the communities that can be negatively affected by AI.
So David Harvey, this technology is developing faster than any other technology in history. I think in my own personal life about the impact of something like spell check, which has, I think for a lot of people, basically obviated our spelling abilities. Do you think that something like this is going to fundamentally change like the skill set of your students because of their reliance on it or how they interact with it?
Yeah, absolutely. My biggest concern is the impoverishment of critical thinking skills. So because a lot of my students are they don't have the cognitive development, the maturity, the awareness to understand like the long-term implications of just letting AI or ChatGPT do its thinking for itself. Like that. So my main focus in those class discussions is, again, to have it generate some topics of discussion, and then we take it from there, come back to it again with another prompt. So you mentioned the prompt crafting. That really comes up in a lot of our conversations, because the first prompt that we use, imagery in a novel, it's very, very generic and very bland. There's not a lot of specifics. So then we reframe the question, and we get a different one, and then we're training it to do that thinking. But again, just the metacognition of being aware of like, how is this? I can't let it think for me. I have to be able to you said, open that skill set and be adaptive in how they use it in the classroom, how they use it to help them get ideas. And then when they do get ideas from them, when do they cite it? When do they not cite it? And then if it inspires a different idea, then that's theirs. Great. But that's the main focus there for us.
Well, a lot of good discussion. There'll be a panel discussion tonight on this topic from 6 to 7:30 p.m. at UNF at the John A. Delaney Student Union. I'd like to thank Dr. Josh Gellars, Dr. Georgette Dumont from UNF, and Duval County teacher David Harvey. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.